Hello and welcome to AEF TV in association with Engerati. And I'm joined now by Ian Greenstreet, who is the chairman of Infinity Capital Partners, but wears two hats, also board director at Diamond Bank. Ian, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. And Ian, we had some conversations at the reception last night, but I've also done, I think at now, about 26 interviews. And during the course of those interviews, there is a disparity of information coming to me, and one of them is a lot of people saying, hey, we've got lots of bankable projects, but people aren't investing. And also people who are saying, yeah, we've got the money, but we can't find the bankable projects. So somewhere there's a disconnect. I suspect, based on our conversation last night, the disconnect is in what a bankable project should look like and people's interpretation of what that is. But you're better placed to sort of paint that picture than I am. So hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a really key question. And it's a key question not just in the power sector, but for projects in Africa as a whole. Because clearly, if you look at the United States and the Western world, you see that the returns being earned on investments are extremely low at the moment, and yet the dilemma, of course, is that you've got projects which are, there in Africa earning supernormal returns, and generally speaking, you would expect money to actually follow towards the sort of profitable projects. So a key question is why that's not occurring, and often it's how the projects are put together. You really have to put together projects in a professional manner, advised by people who know how to do these things. And we pride ourselves as people who are able to do this. We act as financial advisors, wearing two hats, Diamond Bank and Infinity Capital Partners. But just to sort of, there are many facets of a bankable project. It's having the right EPC contractors, the right sponsors, having shared values, having sponsors who've got the high performance metrics that people like us required. But you go back even to the basics. It's not something that you just fall out of bed one day and say, I'm going to build a power project. It involves looking at where you're going to locate the project, the water available, the financial sort of clout to be able to have the staying power to get to the end. It's having also the right planning, the right project managers, the right financial advisors.
And then mix that in with the political will, because you don't want to get halfway through building a hydro project and then suddenly, the political will goes and then you haven't got that backing.
It's clear that you've got to have the right framework in place. The political backing is one thing, but the approach we like to take is that you need to have the right framework in place, because political backings come and go, and therefore the right commercial structure in place is absolutely key. So, for example, one of the projects that we have backed to the end and will complete next month is the first indigenous independent power project in Nigeria. And the key thing there is, how do you get paid? You make all these investments. It's so important to have the right fuel supply, in place, and be able to export power and getting paid. But how do you get paid? Lots of discussion in this conference in terms of PPAs, whether it should be local currency, foreign currency. But on that particular project, what we've worked together with the sponsors is ensuring that you have a multitude of different customers. So you have the industrials, you have the retail, and then you also have the grid where you talk about the sort of PRG and making sure the utilities are sort of credit-worthy enough to ensure you get paid. So it's having a diversity of customers. So that, we think, is absolutely key and a differentiating factor.
So with that power project in particular, are you saying that you've kind of done direct deals with industrial customers who need power and say, right, okay, we will supply you at this rate, and that's what you mean by, okay.
Yes,
right.
yes.
Yeah.
Rather than just simply generating power and then supplying it to the grid, where you are dependent upon the public utility paying you, where you are dependent upon the creditworthiness of the public utility, where you are looking at the bulk trader, etc., and you're saying, well, am I going to get paid, am I not going to get paid? What's the content of that one single document? You know, is that one single document structured adequately? Because, you know, we've made a 20-year investment, and if that one document is wrong, well, that mothballs the power project.
Exactly.
So we are very driven by ensuring that the commercial realities of the project stack up. And by the way, you know, when I ran risk for ABN AMRO Bank, LaSalle Bank, one of the key things that credit people, the mistakes they made was, you know, relying too much on implicit government support and misjudging that. And if you look at the Moody's ratings, where perhaps there've been some, you know, where the reality is worked out to be slightly different to the initial rating, was where it was a misjudgment in terms of, you know, political support. So what we like to do is the framework has to be in place, the tariff regime has to be in place, the legal enforceability of contracts have to be in place, but most importantly from our perspective, or as importantly, the commercial structure has to be self-sustainable.
And that then in a way kind of de-risks it, because you've got 5, I don't know, I'm just saying these numbers, I don't know how many you have, 5 industrial customers, 10 retail customers, and that alone is going to take 30% of your power, so the rest of the 60% then goes to the utility, and if that falls over, you still got these guys, but you know, it's like...
And in our case, actually, you know, it's mostly into the commercial industrials and retails, and any excess power is then similar to the grid. And if we find that we can't, if the power grows, you know, greater than our expectations, we can then import power from the grid and supply that. So it's a very, very interesting model, and I think it's going to be a model which will help transform the Nigerian power industry, and then, you know, perhaps sub-Saharan Africa. Because one interesting statistic is that if you look at Latin America, there are many, many more private sector power producers as compared to Africa, where in many countries there's 1 or 2.
Yeah.
So, you know, the private sector, you know, has to take the lead and move this forward.
And I suppose also with Africa, I suppose like Latin America and unlike places like Europe, you don't. In Europe, you've got the sophisticated grid, which by and large reaches everywhere. You know, I say by and large because there's still pockets, but in Africa, I would imagine that you've got. I was talking to another gentleman. You've got pockets of high energy intensity, like mining regions and things like that, which need power. And sometimes it doesn't make sense to have a grid-based solution. That what you actually want is the generation and the demand in one place.
Absolutely. What you want to do is take a decentralized approach to the supply of power. Even just technically, the moment that you attempt to supply power over long distances, there's technical losses. There's lossage of power.
Well, it's pure physics, isn't it?
Pure physics.
I-squared rule.
Absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. So, but on top of that, politically, you empower people in an area to take responsibility for their own needs. They're bought into the power mechanisms in this area, the distribution, the generation, the transmission. They feel ownership, they feel part of it, because the great thing about power is it has a massive multiplier effect. That, you know, 1 minute an area has no power, darkness, next minute you light up an area. What does that do? That encourages economic activity. That means that, you know, industries can move into that area. You need to have stable power to be able to run those industries. That is, you know, a great sustainable model for elevating growth and wealth into a particular area.
And do you not think that sometimes I get a feeling? I mean, certain interviews I've done, I feel like there seems to be this very enlightened approach. But other interviews I've done where I kind of feel that there is sort of a view of doing power which is very Western, and it's almost what is coming out of those interviews is, hey, we're going to build a massive grid in Africa, which to me, I mean, as just putting a common sense filter on it, just doesn't make sense. And I find it a bit odd that there are still companies who are saying that, when I would imagine that the ministers who've been here, and certainly the ones I've interviewed, they aren't thinking like that. They don't necessarily want that. They know they've got regions that they need to power, but they also, like you were saying, they don't see that, well, building a transmission line for 2,000 kilometers, it just doesn't make sense.
Yes, I mean, I think there are, in substance, I agree with you. And it's back to the issues that I've sort of talked about: decentralization, ownership of one's own destiny, dare I say it, in terms of power. But obviously there are certain circumstances where a country that has perhaps been endowed with an environment which is conducive to producing power supplies excess power to another country that maybe is landlocked, that maybe doesn't have very much water. I mean, building a power plant in Arizona is different to building a power plant when you've got lots of water. With the power, you need to have water to cool, to cool the turbines, to basically cool the power plant. So I think I wouldn't want to generalize. I would be always careful about generalization.
Sure.
But the general thrust is that a decentralized approach is something which is absolutely key.
Yeah. And I would imagine then that the definition of a smart grid in Africa would look completely different to a definition of a smart grid in Europe.
Without doubt. Yeah. There are different considerations.
Yes.
Take Nigeria, for example. It's endowed with 186 TCF of gas. It has a large population. It's a question of getting the power done and executed. Whereas perhaps a country like UK, there's much more a focus on energy efficiency.
Yes.
The usage of power, and therefore renewables are sort of a key component, and subsidies, etc.
Sure.
Nigeria is just a question of getting the power done and out.
Yeah. And because what many people don't underestimate, and I think they look at this as the fear lens, and it's like going, oh, all these people, they're going to consume all this power, and their lens is through a Western power consumption. Whereas what, I think we briefly touched on it when we were chatting last night, is like, actually, it's about having the light on just a little bit longer, and, and very simple like that. It's not a huge demand.
But the statistics, you want to be careful with statistics. Obviously, in certain Western colder countries, there's a greater requirement for heating.
Yes.
Whereas, sort of in a more tropical environment, there's requirements for air conditioning, but not everybody needs or has an air conditioner. Yeah. So there's, the dynamics are slightly different.
Yeah. Absolutely. And going back to the point we touched on earlier, which seems to be a thread throughout conversations I've been having, is going back to this skills thing and people thing. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I sense you're saying is that while the projects might be there, it's actually about the people and having those right people. How and what are the moves afoot to try and there's immense will, certainly being here, to try and bridge this gap of people, because I would imagine you can import skills, but that again is not necessarily sustainable because you want to have homegrown skills as well. Where is that activity?
I think that's a phenomenal question, and I think the skills issue is a key game changer in this sector. One of the things that we do is bring the financial skill set to the power project and being able to access a lot of the identifying the right projects and being able to access, the finance which is available and put together. I think it's also about putting together the right crew, the right sets of people, and it has to be a combination. It has to be a combination of, solid local skill sets and some foreign skill sets. Yeah. So, for example, it's even about how you're building your power plant. At the power plant that we've supported, you have essentially local Nigerians who are working with a few expatriates who've worked together. So they've formed the right crew and having used to working with each other, and that's a phenomenal advantage.
And that's sometimes also, what causes sort of discontent when people see, oh, this thing's being built, but actually it's being built by a whole bunch of people outside of our country, and that can be a cause of discontent. When why aren't we getting those jobs and things like that?
For me, there's an effective project. There is little competition between the local skill set and the foreign skill set in an effectively well put together project. Some of the things that we get involved in helping making a project bankable, okay, because bankable extends to a whole host of things: the security, the selection of the team involved, and there's some things which are perhaps better done, for the moment. Sure. Externally, like, for example, the manufacture of a turbine at the moment. But things are moving on. So, for example, the maintenance of a turbine can be done in country. Sure. Okay, because actually you can make a local country, a hub, which could then service, other power plants in the area by building that local capacity, and that's also more efficient because you can react quicker. You don't have to try to sort of get a consultant coming in from somewhere in the US or somewhere in Europe and say, sort of, come and fix this, slight thing that's gone wrong on this machine. You're able to react quite quickly because you've got that local resource.
And you can use the technology to create that efficiency, so you can have like a center of excellence. It's a bit like when Rolls-Royce made that game-changing decision that actually how we're going to supply our jet engines, we're going to supply it on a service model. And they've got this massive center that monitors every jet engine all around the world, and the same with gas turbines and stuff like that, and that's immensely encouraging. So because we're kind of getting to the end of our time here, and I really enjoyed chatting, and I wish we had more time. But if I could turn you just for a second into my roving reporter, and we're now nearly at the end of the conference, so you've got a lot to draw on. What would be your sort of highlight conversation or highlight thing that's come out of this conference, and you're like going, I'm really glad that's come out, we're talking about that?
Well, I think for me, the very innovative point, which hasn't come out in any of the other conferences, is how you stimulate local capital markets. Right. Some of the subjects like the PPAs, they've been talked about over a number of different conferences. But here, we talked a little bit about how we can stimulate, get sort of local lending long term. And for a bankable project, you need to have long-term local finance, because you can't do a power project and get only 2-year funding. Yes. Okay, and of course, potentially external funding to cover sort of the foreign currency element. And I think there's extremely innovative ways of which have not yet been done in Africa, of stimulating that long-term local lending, and I'm absolutely convinced that that will have a game-changing impact. And just for your information, we're following up with a number of the people on this conference to drive forward that change in Africa.
So the next time we speak, potentially in Istanbul, we can maybe pick that up and talk about some of the other projects that you've helped enable through some of those connections you've made here. Ian, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm sorry we've come to the end of our time, and thank you very much for watching. And you can see this interview and others on AEF, EnergyNet, as well as Engerati. And as a result of all of these interviews, we may be putting together a type of knowledge hub from all the presentations that have come out of here into one area, but you will know more about that below this interview. Thank you.